open public lectures under the UI International Visiting Professor Program. And Dr. Kevin Nute is an architectural lecturer in architecture department, University of Hawaii at Manoa. His previous lecture is about Frank Lloyd Wright and Japan. And for today's lecture, he will continue talking about Japan, but from different angle, from different terms in relations to constructed other. I will not talk too much, and please let the Dr. Kevin Nute deliver his lecture. Okay, Kevin, please. Thank you very much.
Kemas, thank you so much for your introduction. I have a lot of material, so I'm grateful for some additional time. As Kemas just explained, today's topic is related to the one I talked about last time, but a wider head. So Western perceptions of Japanese architecture and beyond just one individual, Frank Lloyd Wright. So let me share my screen with you. Make sure I've got this right. And do let me know if for some reason my presentation is not advancing. That occasionally happens, and notice that I'm talking about something that doesn't appear to be on the screen, then do let me know. Thing I should mention is that I have what amounts to a second topic to try to cover today. I don't know if we'll have time to do it or not. It relates. If you imagine these three talks, Right in Japan, The Constructed Other, and Towards a Test of Cultural Misappropriation is the last one, which is a bit of a mouthful, but they're a bit like Russian dolls. One fits inside the next, and then there's a bigger one in terms of the context. So it starts with the specific individual, Frank Lloyd Wright, then it goes to Western views of Japan, Japanese architecture, and then the last one, if I manage to have enough time, looks at the general topic of how cultures can learn from others, and are there circumstances under which it's acceptable for forms to be taken out of their original cultural context and placed in another. And if that is the case, then what would be the rules? What would be the parameters? So without further ado, I'll jump in. So the constructed other comes from, or the notion of the constructed other comes from the German idealistic philosopher G.W.F. Hegel. He was one of the first, if not the first, to really talk at any length about the notion of the other being an important part of self-identity. In other words, in order to understand who we are, the other is an important sort of counter to that. We know what we are because we are not the other, or the other is not us. Hegel then comes to the conclusion, argues that human identity is essentially a construction, a mental construction. And by implication, so is the identity of the other. They are created in our minds. We are who we think we are, or at least who others think we are. And likewise, so is the other. So I wanted to talk today about the way that Japanese architecture and Japanese culture in general, but specifically Japanese architecture, has been construed by non-Japanese and primarily Westerners. And to look at the gap between that constructed other, that image, and the reality of Japanese architecture, and very often there was a considerable gap. So I won't go into, there's a lot of text, probably more than there really needs to be here, but essentially Japan in the middle of the 19th century, when it was reopened forcibly to the West, was almost the perfect, ideal other. It had been closed for over 2 centuries to the outside world. It was on the opposite side of the globe from most Western cultures, and therefore inaccessible for 2 really important reasons. And as a result, many myths grew up around this closed, mythical culture. And one of the reasons that those myths grew was because it was not possible to dismiss or correct those ideas, because so few people had actually been to visit Japan. And that still applied for much of the second half of the 19th century. It was a very small number of Western visitors who actually traveled to Japan, and they tended to exaggerate, because that was what was popular in the Western press and got readership, any differences. So they were, it was not good press to come back and say, well, you know what, they have 2 arms and 2 legs, and they behave a lot like we do. It was much more interesting and would sell more papers and books if people came back and said, wow, everything is upside down and ran the wrong way, and they do things in completely the opposite. And that kind of attitude, I am arguing, actually pervades Western perceptions of Japanese architecture throughout, right up to this present day. So, as I said, Hegel argued that the identity of the self is constructed; it's a mental construction, and so then, by definition, is the other, and the other, again, by definition, is different from the self, and it is rarely equal. Sometimes equal but different, but most of the time, and we'll see some examples of this, if the other is considered other and therefore different, it's either going to be considered inferior or superior to the self. And that evokes different responses. If the other is considered to be inferior, well, there's no real need to incorporate it. In fact, more often in colonial terms, it's a more common reaction for a dominant culture to say, well, this is an inferior culture, so we will impose our culture on it, and the locals should be grateful for that. And that goes throughout Southeast Asia and many other parts of the world, of course. On the other hand, if something within the other is considered superior and missing from the self, then the natural kind of response is to try to procure that other characteristic. The trick is, though, how do you procure a new characteristic for something that is other without actually losing your own identity? And that's something that I wanted to talk about, or undermining the identity of the other. That's something that I wanted to talk about if I get a chance in the second half today. So I need to move on quickly. So first, preconceptions then. For many Westerners who've never visited Japan, the notion of this Oriental Eden, occupied by mythical kind of noble savages, then was the term, was loomed very large in popular publications. Here, for example, we have Oscar Wilde, the late 19th century British aesthetician, and he's basically saying, you'd make a mistake if you went to Japan. The whole of Japan, and you can see this for yourself, depicted in Japanese art is a myth. Even Japanese art, the image of Japan that was reaching Europe in the 1870s and 1880s was largely through woodblock prints, which were cheap, and the story goes that they were so cheap that they were being used to wrap Japanese ceramics. I'm not sure how true that is, but the prints certainly shaped Western perceptions, early Western perceptions of Japan. And first of all, they were out of date by 100 years in many cases, but also they were Wild is correct in saying, well, they were idealized. You know, they didn't really reflect the reality of late 19th century Japan at all, and possibly any period of Japanese history. They were idealized versions. So here's Oscar Wilde saying, you know, the image of Japan is separate from the reality, and you know, you'd be wise, if you want to keep the image, not to actually travel to Japan, because your image will be destroyed on contact with the real Japan. So some examples of those kinds of images. Some of them will be familiar to you, but it wasn't just the prints. We see two of the prints above, Hokusai's Great Wave, everybody knows that one. But Hiroshige's Snow at Kambara, equally famous. And of course, photography was coming into its own at this time. And even photographs, at least for foreign consumption, conform to this idealized Eden. You know, this is clearly on the left, is in a studio. The one on the right, it certainly is a real photograph, but it's been artificially colored, obviously. But these were the kinds of images that the West was receiving. So it was very edited, very idealized vision of Japan. Likewise, the actor prints, the courtesan prints, all kind of conspired to create an image of Japan as different as could possibly be imagined. And anything that seemed similar just never made it into Western publications because it wasn't interesting. So this myth grows and grows that this culture is almost the antithesis of Western European culture. So actor prints, the sumo prints, this was all, you can imagine, in the early 20th century, late 19th century, would have been considered extremely unusual, exotic, and other. Likewise, there were very few samurai wandering around in the second half of certainly the late 19th century in Japan, and yet you know, that was the image that Westerners wanted to consume. That was what Westerners wanted to believe of Japan. The reality was that more people were wandering around in a top hat and tails and Western clothing at this time than in samurai gear. So after these kind of popular images, then we come to Japanese architecture, which sort of fits within this greater image of Japan as this exotic Eden. First writers on Japanese architecture tended to be not architects. They were the first visitors. So a couple of examples then, US Navy lieutenant completely dismisses Japanese architecture. You know, it's not known as an art amongst them. And even somebody as familiar with Japan as Rutherford Alcock, who was a diplomat for more than 20 years in Tokyo, you know, comes straight out and says they have no architecture, which is like stunning. Now, when we think about Japanese architecture, it's so widely respected. You know, it's hard to believe that this was actually a real opinion. And largely it was because these were completely ethnocentric opinions. They were based on a preconception of what architecture should be, and architecture, you know, in Western countries was made of stone and you know, had multiple stories. And at that time, traditional Japanese architecture, you know, most of it outside of the castles was not built of masonry, and it wasn't high rise except for some pagodas. So because it didn't fit the Western mode, it was completely dismissed. So this is a classic example of the South basically dismissing the other as inferior and dismissing it out of hand, you know, that they don't really have any architecture. And, you know, that had serious consequences because it wasn't very long before Western styles of architecture began to be imported en masse into Japan. Slightly more enlightened commentary written by the Scottish designer Christopher Dresser, and he went to many architectural sites, including the shrines at Nikko on the left at the top, and very early went to and even drew the shrines at Ise Jingu, and they are radically different. if you could see actual photographs, one is richly decorated, and of course Issei is completely undecorated, plain wooden structure. And yet Dresser was sensitive enough to recognize the merits of both. He didn't dismiss either, although they were radically different. And some Western writers on architecture were not as wise, put it that way. This one in particular, the American Ralph Adams Cram in 1905, absolutely dismisses the shrines at Nikko as just pure decoration and not architectural. And he was even more derogatory about Issei, the shrines at Issei, ugly and barbarous, which is kind of hard to believe from today's perspective, that any self-respecting architect could be that insensitive to Japanese architecture. So he's dismissing both of the admittedly very different architectural types that Christopher Dresser had praised. So Westerners tended to pick and choose, what according to their own preconceptions, right up until perhaps this individual, who I mentioned a couple of weeks ago when talking about Frank Lloyd Wright. Edward Morse was a zoologist by training, not an architect, became an expert on Japanese ceramics, but wrote, again, what I believe to be the best and most detailed account of the Japanese house, still to this day. And it was published in 1886. So some of the images or engravings from Morse's book. And Morse really marks the point when Western writers start to sort of say, well, yes, it is very different. Japanese architecture is very different, but it appears to be on a par with our own. It has aspects that we could learn from. And in fact, we've begun to learn from them. So he's describing the popular, the impact of Japanese interior design and design in general on Western interiors during the 1880s, when it became something of a craze amongst the upper classes in Europe and in particularly the northeast of the United States. So next we come to not just describing, but when the other, as I mentioned earlier, is perceived as having characteristics that admirable characteristics that the self doesn't possess, then there's a move to attempt to acquire, as Morse described in that last slide. So I wanted to show you the range of ways in which Westerners have attempted to acquire the other in Japanese architecture. So first of all, the other was given to them in the form of these Japanese pavilions that were built by and funded by the Japanese government. The top one at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. It's known as the Japanese dwelling, although it doesn't look like any Japanese dwelling. It's kind of more like a storehouse. But and then I showed you the image of the hall in the Phoenix Hall from the Chicago Exposition of 1893. So these expositions were fast and frequent in the late 19th century, and the United States had probably 4 or 5 within the space of 3 decades. So there were authentic Japanese buildings in the United States, in some of the bigger cities, from the 1880s onwards. And I talked about how Wright would have had the Hoden to look at for almost half a century before it burned down. But then the next phase is for Westerners to start to want to acquire in their own architecture characteristics that they admired in traditional Japanese buildings. And one of the most famous examples is the Arthur Knapp House in Fall River, Massachusetts. And it was designed, ironically, by Ralph Adams Cram, the architect who dismissed Issei and the Nikko shrines in Japan. Arthur Knapp had been a Christian missionary in Japan and missed it when he came back. And he had this sort of mixed Japanese Western house built, but an authentic tea room at the back. And in the end, he spent most of his time in the tea room and not in the sort of hybrid house. Likewise, I don't know if I should have checked whether there was a family relationship, but this house in admittedly much later, this comes from the 1880s, but a little later, actually, 1890s. But this house in Washington, you can see similarly, is picking up sort of superficial external details of Japanese architecture, but often architecture that was not domestic, that it was sort of picking up elements of temples and applying it to dwellings. So a kind of odd hybrid attempt to acquire the other. More famously, and perhaps more subtly, the architects Green and Green from the early part of the 20th century in Pasadena, mostly near Los Angeles, absorbed more deeply than Japanese carpentry details without directly copying the sort of external forms. So the left, I think both of these are actually the Gamble house, famous Procter & Gamble magnate's house. And you can see, I hope you can recognize the treatment of the wood, the no nails, there are wooden connectors, etc. Has a sort of Japanese feel to it, but it's also a product of the arts and crafts. So it's very hard to sort of say, well, this is Japanese, but it was clearly influenced by, although the Greens had not visited Japan when they built most of their houses. I showed you this 2 weeks ago at another level, at the level of a plan and section. Somebody like Frank Lloyd Wright was acquiring Japanese architecture at a sort of geometrical level. So here's the Imperial Hotel, seemingly coming from the plan of the Phoenix Hall in Chicago. So these are all different levels of formal acquisition of aspects of Japanese architecture, from the superficial, sort of directly recognizable architectural details to more subtle approach to materials to underlying geometrical forms. But they're all attempts to acquire something that is admired in the other. My apologies about the sound effects in the background. I showed you this last week, so I won't dwell on this, but again, there's no effort to acquire the architectural external details at all, very deliberately, but it's at the level of geometry, the underlying partie, that Wright, for one, is acquiring the other, and a section, and some of the other details, or other examples of buildings that Wright seems to have been influenced by. Next, we come to something that I'm calling projections. It could have been called reflections. Basically, another means of effectively acquiring the other is to say that it's just like the self. In other words, if I describe something, or Wright describes, as he did many times, Japanese architecture as organic, to some extent he has taken possession of it. It's his thing, and I very much believe that that's what he wanted to do. That he admired it so much that he had to label it so that it actually became his. Now, I don't think he was very conscious about that, but I think that was what was going on when he was so insistent that it was organic. So you can read the quotes for yourself, but there are numerous ways that he interpreted the organic, which I won't go into today. I went into it a lot last week. But this labeling of the other according to a familiar category is one way that self can acquire the other and sort of say, well, it belongs to me. Although it raises many questions about whether that's legitimate to apply basically Western constructions, and the notion of the organic was a sort of 18th, 19th century Western, well, actually much older Western construction, whether it was applicable or whether it was appropriate to apply that to a culture that really didn't have such a notion. More examples of the way that Wright essentially took possession of the other that was Japanese architecture by labeling it as organic, which he considered was his personal kind of label stamp. Somewhat later, about a decade later, in the 1930s, this individual, Bruno Taut, the German modernist, did something somewhat similar, maybe less overtly, but in the process of trying to help out Japanese architects who were in the middle of a debate over the future of Japanese architecture, whether it should go nationalist, which meant putting traditional Iramoya temple roofs on buildings, or whether it should stay on its then current course of being international modernist. And I won't go into detail, but this was a time in Japan when nationalism and militarism was growing, and the Architectural Institute of Japan was under great pressure to become more nationalist and give up this fashion of international modernism, which was kind of had an image of being kind of socialist, and that was not in keeping with Japanese government ideology. So effectively then, Taut, quite innocently, and he wasn't sort of pushing his own philosophy, I believe, but was trying to help out his Japanese colleagues, came down firmly that buildings like Katsura Rikyū on the left were essentially modern, and buildings like the richly decorated Toshogu that I spoke about earlier were, again, barbaric, kind of overloaded Baroque, I believe he called it. And he was doing it, as I said, to help out, or to try to help out, although it had lots of other repercussions. He was trying to say, well, Katsura is genuinely in the Japanese tradition, whereas the Toshogu was imported by the shoguns from China. It's really Chinese, and therefore, you shouldn't be applying these kind of temple roofs to contemporary Japanese architecture because it's not genuinely Japanese. It's from outside. Whereas this stuff, which just happens to be modern, represents the true kind of mainstream of Japanese tradition. So he was playing a fairly sort of, I don't know, double game, I suppose. And I believe, at least for a few years, it worked. But it had the effect of sort of reinforcing the image of the Toshogu as sort of like second-rate, not proper. And the idea that it wasn't Japanese when it had been in the country for 500 years or more is somewhat questionable. But you can see how Westerners have brought, either deliberately or innocently, they brought their own preconceptions. The notion of Katsura as being essentially modern, and the notion of Japanese architecture in general being organic. These ideas had no root in Japan. They were completely imported by Westerners, and this was a way of, as I said, acquiring the other by stealth, in a way, by stamping it with a Western category. This continued right into the 1960s. The only thing that's missing in the title of this is, instead of modern, it says contemporary, which I suppose his publisher probably said, if you say it's modern, it could go out of date. But contemporary, but this is a very large book and an excellent book. But basically, it's continuing that discussion of how, in this case, the Japanese traditional Sukiya style dwelling is sort of proto-modernist. So it's the same argument that people like Bruno Taut and Walter Gropius had been making for 30 years. A little bit later in, actually not that much later, a little bit earlier, just when Japan was being welcomed back into, there was an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, including an authentic traditional Japanese house, which I don't know if you can see it, but it's in this extraordinary, incongruous setting against all these high-rise buildings, but there it is. And Arthur Drexler, a very smart, very intelligent curator, sets out in the brochure how Western architecture not only was traditional architecture sort of modern, but that modern Western architecture had learned many of these, or picked up many of these modern characteristics from studying traditional Japanese architecture. So by this time, it's become a kind of full circle. The traditional Japanese architecture has modern characteristics, and contemporary Western modernism then learnt some of those characteristics from traditional Japanese architecture. And then coming more up to date in the sort of 80s and into the 21st century, the series of 3 books then, The Empire of Signs, written by Roland Barthes, really about seminology and the notion of Japan and its buildings, but not only its buildings, being a culture in which the sign is dominant over, for example, architecture. I should have brought some, well, I did bring some, but this had been the same. This is contemporary, I'm guessing Ginza. And you can see, it's hard to see any buildings, the signs dominate. And of course, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott-Brown and Steve Eisenach, in their study of Las Vegas, make the same point, that the strip at Las Vegas is all about the sign, and the buildings are these simple boxes that are sort of in the back of the lot. And then coming up more up to date, Barry Shelton sort of brings these together in his excellent study on the Japanese city, which I think came out in about 2008. It's been republished since then. And he's very clear about that, in the title, Learning from the Japanese City. So it's interesting how sort of the postmodern interpretation, which is a Western interpretation, and it begins of the Japanese city, begins with Roland Barthes. And then, without any acknowledgement, but I'm curious whether Venturi and Denise Scott-Brown were aware of Roland Barthes' analysis of Japan, and Tokyo in particular, when they started their work on Las Vegas. There's no reference to it, so I don't know. But this sort of postmodern, the application of postmodern principles of semiology, in particular to the Japanese city, when, again, this was a branch of philosophy that was rooted in the West and being applied to Japanese culture and the Japanese city in particular. So this procuring by labeling Japanese culture and Japanese architecture with Western labels has continued from right and the organic right up to the sort of postmodern, the city as a system of signs interpretation into the 21st century. So next, we are jumping around in time a little bit, but I wanted to keep these concepts together rather than go chronologically. Then distinctions. Then there's also been a sort of counter movement against or in opposition to, I don't know if it was consciously, but certainly de facto in the opposite direction amongst Western writers, and particularly lately amongst Japanese writers on Japanese architecture, to maintain the otherness. The self's attitude to the other is sort of self-contradictory in a way that when it discovers the self, when the self discovers the other, it wants to eradicate that otherness. On one hand, it either wants to impose itself on the other, so that the other becomes the self, or take the self and absorb it, or take the other and absorb it into the self. But at the same time, in order to maintain its own identity, the self always needs another. So there's this conflict, and it's well summed up in the Western relationship with Japanese architecture, of wanting to possess Japanese architecture, but also at the same time wanting it to remain at arm's length and to remain other. Otherwise, how would we have our own identity, right? How can we maintain the self if the other completely disappears, right? If there's no distinction between Japanese architecture and Western architecture. So so distinctions then, there was this sort of countercurrent in the opposite direction, to not say that Japanese architecture is just like ours, or to take possession of it, but to keep it at arm's length and sort of admire it from a distance. So in the 1920s, there was an international modernist group, the Bunriha Kenchukai, and one of their leading members was Stemi Horiguchi, and they were producing work of this kind. And honestly, the top left one, you know, if I hadn't labeled it, it would be very hard to tell where in the world, you know, it could have been anywhere, in Europe, even in the United States. Happens to be that it was in Tokyo, because it is absolute international style. Now, the interior may well have been different. It was quite common, not just in modernist buildings, but in others as well in Japan at this time, to mix modern interiors with traditional Japanese washitsu, and that still goes on to this day. Modern Japanese apartments will often have a traditional tatami room. But you can see how these are, and here's another example of that mixture, right? Here's one part of the same house, and here's another, right? But you can see how externally, in most of these Horiguchi buildings, they are, you know, absolutely international style, and that was largely the intent. Although they had Japanese adaptations, and there was a reaction against that amongst many Western architects, and one wonders, well, what business is it of Western architects to have any opinion on this? But they always seem to give an opinion, just as I am today. Right? And it is odd that the world feels obliged and what's the word? Privileged to be able to give an opinion on Japanese architecture. And I don't know that there are any other architectures where the world feels the same way. You know, but here's Antonin Raymond, a well-known internationalist stylist, in an article on the probable future of Japanese architecture. And here's what he's thinking that Japanese architecture would look like, and presumably should look like. Right? And here's, you know, the two realms: Western architectural history and Japanese architectural history, or sorry, Far Eastern, including Indonesia, by the way. So he wasn't exactly right, but he was closer than a lot of other Western commentators then, who thought that contemporary Japanese architecture should and would look like an updated version of traditional Japanese architecture, of sort of post and beam, steel frame, and Raymond predicted that it would be concrete, and this was in the early 20s. You know, so there was that was prophetic, because that's actually what happened, largely as a result of the expense of steel after the Second World War. Many other efforts to internationalize modern Japanese architecture were criticized. People like Richard Neutra and Taut, Bruno Taut, were themselves sort of international modernists, and yet disapproved of the fact of that direction in Japan. They felt like, well, we don't want you, and nor should you become international modernists. You've got such a wonderful tradition that modern architecture in Japan has to be Japanese. And I don't know of any other culture where that criteria has ever been applied. You know, it's like, British international modernism needs to look British, or French, you know, modernism needs to look French. No, they never applied those. You know, nobody would even dreamt of, you know, it would be, and yet Westerners felt the obligation and the right to give that opinion that Japanese, modern Japanese architecture has to look Japanese, by which they meant it needs to be connected to this wonderful tradition that you have. A very strange sort of double standard coming from modernists in many cases. So here's an example of what they were talking about. This is the famous Japanese pavilion at the Paris Expo in 1937. And this was wildly popular amongst Western critics because it was exactly what they wanted. This was an updated, or at least they read it as such, an updated version of the post and beam Japanese tradition. So it's modern, but it's unmistakably, so it was said, Japanese, this lightness, this sort of airiness, right? And it was somewhat of a false dawn, of course. A few years later, the Second World War broke out. Steel became incredibly expensive, and modern Japanese architecture went, as Raymond predicted, heavy mass reinforced concrete in the line of Le Corbusier. But this is what Westerners wanted. And again, they wanted to apply the criteria, the test of Japaneseness to modern Japanese architecture, a test that was never applied to any other nation that I'm aware of, possibly self-applied. People like Wright obviously claimed that he was creating an American architecture, and it should be, but you know, certainly in the old world, in Europe, it would have been laughed off as ridiculously kind of. So here's the reality. Here's Mayakawa work for Le Corbusier, and here's actually Le Corbusian modernism sort of transplanted into Japan in the 60s. The other great figure, at the foundation of Japanese modernism, then Kenzo Tange. During the war, he wasn't above designing this sort of very traditional Shinto-inspired kind of shrine building for the military government. He was a student, and you know, so he was largely forgiven for all of that. But you know, he wasn't really concerned about the ethics of it, and I think that's probably an unfair. As a student and during the war, would have been very difficult to resist all of that, I suppose. After the war, though, in the Kagawa City Hall, here he is in a sort of historicist mode, where he's taking traditional trabeated timber construction and replicating it in reinforced concrete. This is a skeuomorph, basically where a detail from one construction system is carried over into a completely different construction system where it doesn't make any sense anymore, but it's carried over as a decorative detail. You see it in the triglyphs in the Greek temple. You know, the ends of beams are preserved, even though they're no longer timber. They are preserved petrified in the masonry of the Greek temple. So here is Tange in his early buildings, trying to make his modern Japanese architecture in a kind of superficial way relate to Japanese tradition. And then that got heavily criticized when Tange visited Siam, one of the last, in fact, the last meeting of Siam. Here's Tange over on the right. And he showed these buildings along with some early metabolist projects. And I think he got, reading between the lines, I think he got heavily criticized, you know, that this was not the way that Team 10 and the younger members of Siam wanted modern architecture to go. I don't, you know, the actual text of the conversation has been lost, but reading between the lines, as I say, I think that was the tenor. And it looks like, you know, there's a fairly intense conversation. Look at Aldo Van Eyck here. I don't know if he's just tired or what. So the next big event in contemporary or modern Japanese architecture happened just a couple of years later, a year later, with the publication of Metabolism 1960. And if you're not aware of this, it's a very important sort of watershed in modern Japanese architecture, where this group of, well, 3 architects plus Kawazoe, who was a critic, historian and critic, they were the core of the Metabolist group. It was not an organic kind of group. They were artificially brought together actually by Tange. Asada was an assistant, the right-hand man in Tange's office at the time. So Tange didn't have the time to put together this exhibit himself, so he had Asada organize it with this group of younger architects. And but Tango was certainly wasn't above kind of hanging on to the coattail, and produced his own sort of metabolist project, the famous over-the-top plan for Tokyo Bay, building across, and you know, supposedly as an answer to the land shortage in Tokyo. another example of Tanguay's metabolist influenced, but although he was never officially a member of that group, he was kind of the godfather of the group, and was very aware of the metabolist sort of philosophy, ideology, although he was criticized down here by Guterres a few years later, because even though this looks like a metabolist building in which some parts are permanent, like the core, and some parts could be exchanged, the reality was that all the high-tech technology was in the core. So if you wanted to change out that technology, which would be the shortest in terms of its life cycle, you would have to gut the core. So, you know, there were contradictions, but there were contradictions in all of the metabolist projects. One of the few metabolist influenced buildings that did actually get extended and not just like project the image of potential extension was Tanguay's own Yamanashi Press and Broadcasting Center. In 1915, under an anti-seismic refit, it's hard to see, but the colored areas have been extended. So this was one of the very few, if not the only, metabolist building that actually did fulfill that promise of future expansion. This is the famous Nagakuen capsule tower, which has never been extended, but that was the idea, that it could be, the capsules could be replaced and extended. And of course, they never were replaced, and I don't know where they stand now, but the building fell into disrepair and was being slated for demolition last time I heard. I don't know. So so the Metabolism 1960 manifesto then sparked enormous international interest in Japan. And Guterres, the German architectural writer who lives in Japan to this day, wrote a very famous article in Architectural Design where he basically reproduced much of the Metabolist manifesto. My apologies for the bird in the background. I get visited by these birds on a regular basis, and today I made the mistake of feeding one earlier, so now I'm going to make a lot of noise. Guterres' article on the Metabolist in 1964 adds and makes an effort to connect Metabolist thinking with this traditional notion of change expressed in this Chinese character, one of many meanings of which can be interpreted as change. But my point here is that there was a real effort after Guterres, beginning with Guterres, to read Japanese tradition into the Metabolist ideology, when in fact the Metabolists themselves, almost nowhere in the Metabolist manifesto, Issei is not mentioned, change is occasionally mentioned, time is not mentioned once. And yet these were Western, this is what the West wanted to read into metabolism, and it, in the tradition of Western, projections onto Japanese architecture, that's exactly what it saw. Even though if you actually read the Metabolist manifesto, there are very few, if any, references to Japanese tradition. Their whole point was that, well, we all know you like Japanese traditional architecture, but this is a new Japan. Now we're down with the white heat of science and technology, and it's not that tradition that we want you to pay attention to. We want you to pay attention to us now on our own merits. And the West just blithely ignored that and says, yeah, we know you're rooted in your tradition, and look, we're going to prove it. Even though the Japanese architects themselves were not claiming that, the West has continually insisted that contemporary or modern Japanese architecture has to be Japanese, which means it has to be rooted in their tradition. Otherwise, it's not kosher. So it happens again. The reality is that megastructures had been around since the Plan Opus by Le Corbusier in Algiers, okay? An extraordinary project way ahead of its time. Probably a good thing it was never built. But this was a large permanent megastructure on which people could build their own houses. So it really had many of the essential ideas of metabolism already. And it's 1931 when this is published, right? So 3 decades before. And yet the West lapped up metabolism because it was Japanese and wanted to make it Japanese, and were very resistant to, would have been, although I don't think anybody pointed it out, Rainer Banham was one of the first in the 70s to point out, by the way, megastructures didn't begin with metabolism, you know. But it's same old phenomena that it's not popular to say, you know what, this aspect of Japanese architecture is just like the West. It's much more popular. It goes down a lot better to say, wow, this is so different. It's completely different from the West. Right? So it's that same tradition, ignoring very glaring similarities and preferencing difference. And when there isn't a difference, finding connections to Japanese traditional culture, even when the Japanese themselves are not even claiming such a connection. So here's the Plan Obus, and you can see, I hope, why what was a good thing it wouldn't have, that it was not built. It would have done a good number on Algiers. But this huge megastructure highway, right, with housing beneath it that was interchangeable, that could be replaced and altered. So, you know, 75% of metabolism had already been, you know, theoretically invented by Le Corbusier. So it was not new, and nor was it uniquely Japanese. And the Japanese were not claiming that it was uniquely rooted in their tradition, but certain Westerners insisted that it was. So here are the interchangeable units in Le Corbusier's Unité, right? More famously, again, didn't happen in reality, but this idea that of plug-in, you know, units of a shorter life cycle than the permanent, right? It's all there, you know. This is metabolist theory long before metabolism had come out, but because it came out in Japan, it got its own special attention. It had to be Japanese. So the notion of space-time, again, space-time is a, you know, essentially, I would say, I guess, you know, if you go back to Einstein, you know, there was no such thing as space-time before he published his special theory of relativity, right, in the early part of the 20th century. And the metabolists don't mention time at all in their entire manifesto, and yet that has been one of the interpretations of the Metabolist Manifesto in the West, and it shows you how few people have actually read the actual manifesto, because not once is the word time used. In 1941, a famous book did use the word time and space. So Siegfried Gideon's famous Space, Time and Architecture were published in English in 1941, and then because of the war, it wasn't translated into Japanese until 1955. But I actually believe that this timing, 1955, was not coincidental, that it's just a few years before the Metabolist Manifesto appears, and I think it had an effect on the way the Metabolist Manifesto was interpreted, certainly in the West. A little bit of context here. Siegfried Gideon was married to Carola Gideon Welker. And Otto van Eyck, one of the leaders of Team 10, you saw him earlier in the SIAM meeting, had been a student of Siegfried Gideon, but they fell out over the dissolution of SIAM because Van Eyck and his colleagues, his younger colleagues, were of the belief that space and time were elitist, kind of abstract ideas that had nothing to do with the lives of ordinary people. And after the Second World War, you know, they argued strongly that modern architecture needed to get with real life and stop talking about these abstract sort of pseudo-mathematical ideas like space and time and space-time, right, which had no meaning for regular people. And Van Eyck publishes a very famous article on place and occasion, and it starts in 1960, so and right around the time that Siam is being broken up and this war with the old guard of Siam is going on, and he very pointedly, says, he doesn't just talk about place and occasion, he makes the point of whatever space and time mean, this has to be a dig at his former mentor. Even though he respected him enormously, he was arguing, that space and time were insufficient. They were not enough. They were meaningless to ordinary people. The places were what architects needed to incorporate into built environments to be meaningful. Back to Japan in 1963, a famous article was published by Teiji Ito, Arata Izaki, and a group of others called Space-Time Value, or Japanese Urban Space is the overall name of the publication, and it was published in an architectural journal, Kenchiku Bunka, Architectural Culture, in 1963. And I believe that this was influenced by the publication of Gideon's book, Space, Time and Architecture, in 1955 in Japanese, because no commentators on Japanese architecture, no Western commentators, or even Japanese commentators up until this point had ever talked about time as a special characteristic of Japanese architecture. Then, just a few years after the publication of Gideon's Space, Time and Architecture, suddenly this is discovered in Japanese architecture. And again, although it was discovered by Japanese in this case, it's again an importing of a Western idea and applying that retroactively and saying, oh, Japanese architecture is like this. So space and time didn't exist in the 19th century, or at least the idea, space-time, and it didn't reach Western architecture until 1941 and Gideon's book, right? And then it reaches Japan, although Japanese architecture was not mentioned in Gideon's book as having any time component. But I believe that the title of that book sparked this sort of self-reflection and the finding of time in traditional Japanese urban space. And then that gets picked up by Günter Nisch, the German writer who writes this famous article in 1966 on the Japanese sense of place, which has a temporal component based on this character Ma. I don't have time to go into this. There is an article, which I should have referenced, but called Time and Japanese Architecture, that looks at this in detail and essentially attempts to argue that this temporal component is only discovered, or as I would suggest, projected onto traditional Japanese architecture after the appearance of a famous Western book, Space, Time and Architecture. And then it gets picked up by Japanese, and then it gets echoed and magnified by Günter Nisch and subsequent Western and Japanese writers, to the point where time has become this kind of key distinction that, well, Japanese architecture was not based on space, which is to suggest that all Western architecture was based on a positive concept of space, when in fact a few Renaissance buildings and a few modern buildings were, but the vast majority of Western buildings were not based on any positive notion of space either. So that dichotomy is false. But it usually continues with, but in contrast to the spatial obsession of Western architecture, which is a gross generalization, Japanese architecture was based on time or space-time, which I think is equally hogwash. Right? And I won't go into the details, but please look at that paper if you'd like to see the argument. Again, I think there are so many similarities with non-Japanese architectural features, which are completely ignored in the rush to the stampede to find something different, something other in Japanese architecture, that it's kind of laughable. It's like, let's ignore all the other examples in the world and let's pretend that this is unique. And it's a long tradition of this, both within Japan and outside. And Japanese culture is, of course, unique in so many ways that it doesn't have to in any way. There's no necessity for it to like pretend to be unique in ways that it's not. It's got more than enough unique characteristics. You know, that it's not Chinese culture and it's not Western culture. It's clearly very, very different. But there is this phenomena, certainly in the architectural field, of wanting Japanese architecture to be different and ignoring obvious similarities in order to show that. Here's Izuzaki sort of showing his awareness of Van Eyck and agreeing with it, right? And Izuzaki was one of the authors of that Japanese article, Space-Time or Himuro Hikuka, right? But it all comes after Gideon and after Van Eyck. And you know, here we see Izuzaki is clearly aware of Van Eyck and would have been aware of Gideon too. So this self-reflection, this finding of the temporal component in Japanese architecture, I believe is influenced by external Western factors. Right? So here's Izuzaki with his exhibition on Ma, and here he is, you know, repeating this notion that that the time is the essential difference between Japanese architecture and Western architecture, which I think is just a gross oversimplification. Much as I respect Izuzaki-san's architecture, I cannot agree with this argument. So there are a number of factors that are usually brought up to suggest the temporal component of Japanese architecture. One, lack of a concept of space as a positive entity in Japan prior to the 20th century, the expression of temporal ideas in terms of space in the Japanese language, the notion of kaiwai or activity-dependent spaces, and the anticipation of change in the design of many traditional Japanese environments. And just quickly to summarize, then many of the characteristics of traditional buildings often cited as unique are commonly found in other cultures. Right? So, you know, there are plenty of other vernacular buildings that have adjustable screens. They don't move in the same way, but adaptation and adjustability is not unique to that. It may be uniquely well developed, but you know, it is not absolutely unique to traditional Japanese architecture. You know, look at a swing door. You know, that is a piece of kinetic, adjustable architecture. It is, you know, you can open it, you can close it, you can leave it ajar, right? People don't wax lyrical over that, right? But it is an adjustable component of a very common adjustable component of Western architecture, but completely ignored. And everybody likes to look at the shoji and the fusuma, and you know, sure, they are wonderful, you know, and they're not the same. But the notion of a movable component in architecture, you know, look at a casement window, right? They're everywhere, and we stubbornly strangely ignore those parallels and only focus on these characteristics in Japanese architecture, which I think is unnecessary and unhealthy. So likewise, most languages have a space and time analogy. Think of an analog watch. Most of you don't have them anymore, but you know, time is usually has traditionally been told in terms of movement through space. You know, it's a very, very early. And as I say, most languages, not just Japanese language, most languages use a term for intervals that applies to both space and time. So the notion that Ma is this unique idea, you know, interval, you know, well, the word interval, we use it in English, and I'm sure in other languages too, Indonesia included. An interval can mean an interval of space or time. And that was the original meaning of that character, Ma, in Chinese. Okay, so that character was imported from China, and in China it had a temporal and a spatial meaning. So the idea that it's somehow uniquely Japanese, again, is nonsensical. And then you can read the last part, right, which I've talked about, that time is not really discussed until the 60s, right, when time had become a popular topic in Western architectural conversation in general. So basically, that argument is that it's probably not correct to suggest that that time, the expression of time, was ever a conscious intention in traditional Japanese architecture, but and possibly not even change, but it was adjustable. So it de facto, it did express change, or it did accommodate, not express, but accommodate change. But think about it, what does a swing door do? What does a casement window do? It accommodates change. It adjusts itself, or is adjustable by the people that are present in that room. So, it's not popular to say this, but it's basically the same, that a human being can reach over and move it, adjust it, right? So again, it's this phenomena that if it's in Japan, that it's special, that it's unique, and it isn't always unique, And as I say at the bottom here, to me, none of this diminishes the importance of Japanese architecture. The fact that another culture has discovered different ways of achieving the same objectives, I find that equally, if not more, fascinating. Right? The human beings are not static. They change their opinion. They change their preferences. They like to have their cake and eat it. They want to move stuff. Right? It's not, always in the right place. So the idea that you can open and close a window, move fusuma or shoji panels, it's the same human characteristic. Okay, culturally it's being responded to, specifically in a different form, but as a phenomenon, that architectural response is essentially the same. Emulations, and we are getting on, so I will go through this very quickly. Essentially, then there's been certainly since the 1980s a kind of a motive amongst some Western commentators and designers to want to emulate, then to find the other in the self, so to speak. So this is the Japanese aesthetic term shibui, and this graph shows its usage in English language publications. So you can see it starts at a very, very low level in the 1920s, and then it really spikes in 1960, and it drops off, and it's starting to come up again. Recently, the reason for this spike was 1960, there was a famous two issues of the House Beautiful magazine published, entirely devoted to what at the time, and probably still is, this obscure Japanese aesthetic term, shibui. Right? And this was part of the repatriation, the rehabilitation of Japan after the war. The US State Department was afraid that Japan was going to turn communist. So Japan, that had been, this deadly enemy up until a decade or so before, now had to be rapidly brought back into the popular American fold. So this was very much William Randolph Hearst, a rabid anti-communist, was the owner of House Beautiful. So he was doing his patriotic duty by allowing and encouraging Elizabeth Gordon, the editor, to publish these two entire issues. And their argument was essentially that shibui was like the aesthetic principle, which I think a lot of Japanese would probably take issue with, that it encompasses all the others, including wabi and sabi, for example. And she was getting her information from an individual called Soetsu Yanagi, respected, wrote a wonderful, or there is a wonderful book of his essays called The Unknown Craftsman, but had his own kind of esoteric view of Japanese aesthetics, and it was largely based on shibui. So that's what got published as the Japanese notion of beauty, and other things like wabi and sabi, and many other aesthetic notions were kind of put into the shadow by shibui. So some examples of illustrations from the House Beautiful issues. And they mentioned, Elizabeth Gordon and her editors mentioned and made a big thing of the fact that, look, there were Western cultures that had quite independently of any knowledge of Japanese culture or shibui, produced artifacts that were for every, to all intents and purposes, perfect manifestations of this aesthetic principle of shibui. So the top and bottom here are all Quaker products. And Gordon was basically, Elizabeth Gordon was arguing that the West, that Shibui was an international aesthetic kind of principle, that it wasn't limited to just Japan. Now, I'm not sure what the Japanese would have had to say about that, but this is kind of the inverse of what I was talking about earlier, Wright and Bruno Taut applying Western labels to Japanese kind of architecture. Here we have Elizabeth Gordon, another Westerner, doing the opposite, basically saying, well, these are Quaker, but they're Shibui. So basically saying that, without the permission, I think, maybe she asked Yanagi, but I don't know what the other Japanese thought about, basically saying Shibui belongs to the world. Shibui is international. Shibui is not, you can take it out of its Japanese context and it works just as well. It's independent of its cultural context. And not only did she find examples, historical examples of Western artifacts that she was labeling as Shibui to say, that this unites us with the Japanese, that they have got an aesthetic concept which is, transcends culture then. Just as Wright was arguing that the organic and Taut was arguing that the modern transcended culture. Well, here's the opposite, right? There's a Westerner saying that the Japanese concept, aesthetic concept, transcends Japanese culture. Not only was she doing that, but she was also encouraging and actually got manufacturers to produce lines of textiles and wool, right? Shibui, and you can even, I looked this up recently, and the image on the right is recent. There are still Shibui lines of wool, for example, right? Which I have no idea. I haven't asked any Japanese friends what they think of that. They probably find it amusing. But here we have this, a reversal of that phenomena of procuring the other by labeling it with a Western. So here, in a way, this is procuring in another way, sort of saying, well, we're going to take your aesthetic idea and we're going to apply it to our stuff. So, again, we've kind of procured it, right? And we can produce new lines of things, and we're going to call it Shibui, even though, that's really a Japanese, word, and it belongs to Japanese culture. Essentially they took it, they appropriated it, and they made it part of English. They did talk in those issues a little bit about Wabi and Sabi under this broad title, but it was definitely in a secondary way to this overarching idea. Wabi, just out of interest, then has been discussed. Really, it's about the turn of this century. This graph is a little confusing because Wabi has other meanings, in particular in the Indian language, right? Indian subcontinent. So we may not be looking at just the Japanese, but I believe that this part does apply to that Japanese aesthetic. Sabi, on the other hand, has only really become popular in the last decade, right? Which, but look at the way it's sort of exponentially increased it. So it's only really since the 1960s and much more recently that Wabi and the Japanese aesthetics in general, and much more recently in the case of Wabi and Sabi, have become popular in the West. And then this the hyphenated version only since the 1980s. And this is not something that is particularly popular in Japan. It seems to be predominantly outside of Japan, right? Because these were two distinct aesthetic ideas that have got welded together in this portmanteau. So now you see in the last 20 or so years texts like this, sort of popular books attempting to bring Wabi and Sabi, to appropriate it, I suppose, into English and into Western culture, and take it out of its Japanese context. And even in Sabi, this notion of patina, or visible age, has parallels in the West. The picturesque, the appreciation of ruination goes all the way back, as I said, to to the 18th century at least, ruin and the signs of age as a positive aesthetic characteristic. And then finally, and I know that I said that a few minutes ago, where are we today? And I decided to call this expectations because if there's one characteristic of publications on Japanese architecture, at least in the English language of the last 20, 30 years, it has been, I think, newness and the expectation of newness. And if you think about it, well, back in the late 19th century, traditional Japanese architecture was new because it was, we had not seen it. Even though it was very old, in the West, it was it was novel, right? It was new. In other words, I would argue that the new and the other are almost synonymous in this context. That even traditional Japanese architecture was new to the West in the late 19th century, and that expectation of newness, I believe, has continued in the West. The expectation that Japanese architecture, contemporary Japanese architecture, will be constantly new. And I believe that Japanese architects feel that obligation to be new, that expectation, much more than any other architects in the world. Look at some of the publications. So the most famous Japanese journal is called Shinkenchiku, New Architecture, right? And I believe it's not just the latest, but the other meaning of new, which means different from what came before, right? Not just the most recent, but distinctly different, right? And I think that's really important, that the word shin or atarashi, new in Japan, is understood in that double. It's not just the latest. It's not I bought a new cup, but I bought a new kind of cup. This is a new kind of cup. It's not just the latest version of the traditional cup. And I believe that understanding of the new, of shin or atarashi, is goes to the heart of contemporary Japanese architecture. There is an expectation both within Japan and outside Japan that at least the architects, the people who get in the magazines, then they're not going to get into the magazines unless you do something different. It's that same phenomenon. Nobody in the West will write about any aspect of Japanese culture that is the same as the West, because it's boring. It won't get readers' interest. And it's the same phenomena in the Japanese journals, and to a lesser degree, much lesser degree, I think, but to some degree in the West as well, that you don't get published in a journal unless you're doing something new. And it doesn't mean your latest bungalow extension, it has to be new in the sense of not only the latest, but bringing something new to the table. And that is 100 times greater, that pressure, that expectation to be new, to be other, right? To be novel in Japan is huge. So some covers from Shinkenchiku since 1925. And then some Western publications that use more contemporary on Japanese architecture. And it's totally out of proportion to any other culture to have so many books devoted so frequently, because of this expectation of constant change, that it's considered necessary and appropriate to have 3 books in a decade on contemporary Japanese architecture, because it will have changed that. There wouldn't be that many books on contemporary French architecture in that time, nothing like it. This phenomenon, this interchangeability between new, novelty, and otherness is, I think, the thread that goes from now, an expectation of Japanese architecture to be constantly new, all the way back to the way Japanese culture in general and Japanese architecture in particular was perceived as, it may be very old in Japan, but it's absolutely novel and new and other or would have been at the time. Another very commonly heard term, omoshiroi, and it has multiple meanings, and it's not just interesting, but also unusual. Oops, sorry. And I think that's a part of omoshiroi that is often it's often translated as interesting. But that third meaning there, unusual, is I think even more important. And if you look at some random examples of contemporary Japanese architecture, then there is this sense of fun and unusualness for its own sake, right? Of newness, of otherness, right? It can't be just a boring latest version of some standard modern. It has to be different. And you notice this constant striving to, you know, to kind of to be out there, to get attention. And I believe that, you know, that's part of Japanese culture, but it's also been strongly encouraged by Western expectation, you know, that Japan will always be other. It has to be always different, always strange. Now, the reality is the vast majority of Japanese buildings are more like the ones either side of this building. And that would be true, you know, that stuff doesn't get in the journals, of course, and nor would it in Europe or in the States or anywhere else. But the gap between regular architecture and the stuff that gets in magazines and gets seen overseas is orders of magnitude greater, I believe, in Japan than it would be anywhere else in the world. And that, I think, covers that one. And I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for your patience. That went on a long time. Sorry, a few too many images. But I don't know if you have questions immediately on that, or whether it would be appropriate for me to just quickly jump into that second, much shorter presentation. Kemas, what would you like? What would you prefer? It's been a long time of me talking. So.
That's fine, Kevin. I think it's a lot of important and interesting informations that you share to us today. And
Thank you.
I personally not really familiar with Japanese history of Japanese modern architecture, except metabolisms, Kenzo Tange, and Kiso Kurokawa.
Mhm.
But we cover a lot of materials, important materials, to give more broaden our perspective in relations to history of modern architecture from uh, not only from Western, yeah, usually from Western, but from other Asian country. This is Japanese, and you cover a lot of uh, important and interesting informations, such as Banriha, Kenchikukai, and also that you mentions about Le Corbusier Unité d'Habitation as the earlier example of metabolisms, yeah? Architecture from Western point of view, and also about Wabi and Sabi. This is a philosophical concept, yeah, about Japanese aesthetic and art, which is then applied to Western conception of the space, modern space. And okay, here we have one questions from Naufan Yahya, and I hope other participants can also write the questions on the chat chat screen. Yeah. Naufan asks about
I'm reading the...
oftentimes Japanese architecture utilize local materials, craftsmanship, and even landscape in their building designs. They are mostly applied in their approach of tectonics and how they respond to the surrounding environment. Therefore, how does American architecture manage to incorporate that idea, albeit the differences in building resources?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was looking at the question
Oh, this
above
is the
that,
second question.
Kemas. So
okay.
could I?
Uh,
Yeah.
Kevin.
We answer the
Hello.
first question, and I'll think about the second one. All right. The first question is. Oh, Kemas has disappeared. Can you hear me? Okay. Looks like the first one is. Does my research cover the way Japanese architects used to see and perceive Western modernist architecture? So the opposite. The simple answer would be that's not something that I've really concentrated on, but there's no doubt that Japan and the West have had a kind of mutual understanding, and that each will be the other, or each other's other. Um, uh, Up until the 19th century, or at least 1,000 years before that, China was Japan's other. You know, that Japan measured its culture next to its much larger neighbor, and imported many ideas. But so there was this challenge of how do you import Chinese culture and maintain your own identity. You can imagine if you're importing your language and your law and your aristocratic kind of society all from China, there would be a danger that you might become just a branch of China. So Japan has become very skillful at importing ideas, but at the same time transmuting them and making them Japanese. So their language, and I wanted to talk about that in the other short presentation. Their language is composed entirely of characters, Japanese language, that are derived from Chinese characters, and yet, you know, their syllabaries are unrecognizable by most Chinese. They've been translated into a unique form. So, so the simple answer is I've not focused my researches on how other researchers, people like Ken Oshima and Ari Seligman, have looked at Japanese modernism. That's not something that I've always looked at the way Westerners have looked at Japan, because it is an enormously complicated, either way, it's complicated. And if you look at both, it can get, you know, really complicated. And there's a danger that you miss things in trying to incorporate everything. But there's no question in my mind that the West was very much the new other for Japan, the other that took the place of China. And the challenge then became, how do you import Western technology without becoming culturally like the West? And there were phrases in Japanese, you know, to do with Western technology, Japanese spirit was a very common. We will take your technology, we'll even take your architectural styles, but we are going to maintain our Japaneseness. And this was a very strong, you know, because the Japanese were never really colonized, and they looked around the rest of Asia, and they didn't want the same fate. So they wanted to catch up technologically and not be colonized. So bringing in technology was one thing, but protecting their own culture and not being culturally colonized was a very important feature of the way that the Japanese looked at the West. So I'm not sure that totally answered your question, but I can go on to the question that Kemas was talking about tectonics. Yeah, I think the simple answer to the second question, if people can see it in the chat, my answer anyway would be that I'm not sure that many American architects. Oh, are you having sound issues? Are you still able to hear me?
Yes.
No? Oh, okay. I heard a strange echo then. I think the simple, honest answer, at least my answer, would be most contemporary American architects are not able to source materials locally. You know, this country's supply chains, by and large, are monopolized by big companies, and it's very difficult to break free of that. but it may also be a bit of a myth in Japan as well. I don't know the Japanese construction industry very well, but I do know someone who worked for Christopher Alexander in the 1980s on the Asian School up in Saitama, north of Tokyo, and they attempted to use local subcontractors and local materials, and one of the big Japanese construction companies made it very uncomfortable and very difficult for them to do that. So in other words, it could be, if you're doing a major project, very difficult to source materials locally, even in Japan these days, but certainly in the United States, that's incredibly difficult because you're up against sort of mega corporations. It's like trying to be an independent bookseller in competition with Amazon. You're a minnow, and they can undercut your prices, enormously. So it's super hard. You have to find a client who's prepared to spend much more just so that you can use these local materials. And how many clients are there like that? So yeah, that's not the answer that I want to give, but it's my honest opinion that local materials are a thing of the past, unfortunately. In the majority, there are a few exceptions, but in the majority of projects, and that's probably becoming the same in Japan, because Japan even more. I mean, last time I checked, there were 5 major construction companies and lots of smaller construction companies who tended to work for one of the big 5. So it's a really kind of stratified. Now you can still hire a daiku, a carpenter, who could presumably source materials, but it's very, very difficult in Japan because they don't have the resources, from the very beginning, the forests were limited, the supplies were limited. So if you're working locally in a village, and I do know a guy who's working up in the north of Japan on the Noto Peninsula, who is able to source material, but source material for sort of local projects. But I think that is very much, he's an exception, and I think that is the exception and not the rule. So again, not the question, not the answer that I would like to give, but I suspect that Japan is becoming more like America and not the other way around, sadly.
Okay, thank you.
Kemas, would it be possible for me to very quickly run through those cultural appropriation images, or are we over time?
Yes, yes, you can continue. Yeah, you can
All
share.
right. Yeah. 1 second. Let me share that. Ooh. I think I shared the wrong one. Here we go. Okay, very quickly. Well, you can see this. For some reason, it's not allowing me to put it into play mode, but it's the bigger picture still of how cultures may or may not be able to use forms derived from other cultures without undermining either their own identity or the culture of where that form belongs. And this has been going on, since the dawn of civilization. That without Chinese culture, for example, we wouldn't have had paper or movable type, the compass, et cetera, et cetera. So, ideas have always moved, ideas and forms have always moved across national and cultural boundaries. And it's been a very positive, by and large, a very positive thing. But within the last 2 decades, the appropriation of forms, especially from minority cultures that are under threat, has been frowned upon then. So I'm interested in, just what is legitimate and what is potentially damaging. So very, very quickly in the last 15 minutes that we've got, I use this legal notion that if you've caused no harm, then there's no foul. You haven't broken the law, right? It's a common principle in American law. I don't know how much it applies. It's new to me, but it's common in American law. No harm, no foul. So I thought, well, a test of cultural appropriation or misappropriation, as I'm using the word, would be if there is harm. There are two potential forms of harm that could be caused by deriving or taking forms from another culture. One would be loss, and one would be hurt feelings, offense, basically. Loss could be loss of identity or loss of income, but loss of identity primarily. That if your identifying characteristics are now being used by everybody, then you've lost your unique identity. There are two ways, or two criteria that I'm using, or used in this analysis to determine whether the use of a form would potentially cause harm. One, the form would need to be significant or idea in its original culture. If it's a trivial thing, then somebody reusing it, it's unlikely to do damage to that culture or to offend anybody in any real meaningful way. And also in its new context, that form would need to be immediately recognizable. In other words, if a culture, even though a form was derived from a culture, if members of that culture recognize that form in the new culture, well, where is the harm? How is their culture damaged? And how would they be offended genuinely, right? How could they be offended? Admittedly, offense is a subjective thing, but there wouldn't really be any basis for offense if you can't recognize it. That's very different from somebody stealing a car and changing the color and then the owner not being able to see it, right? There's material form or materiality where, even if it's unrecognizable, it's still to the original owner. But I would argue that immaterial culture, if it's unrecognizable, I think it's questionable whether you can say it still belongs. But that is open for debate. So I looked at four possible permutations where a form that was reused from a culture was neither culturally significant nor immediately recognizable by members of that culture. And you can see the other three. And I wanted to show you some examples of that. And the only one of those four permutations that I was going to categorize as misappropriation, that would potentially do harm to a culture or harm to the feelings of the members of that culture, was the last one, where a form is both culturally significant in its original context and immediately recognizable by members of that culture in its new context. But if either of those is not the case, if it's either insignificant or it's not recognizable, I was arguing that it's, where's the harm? Where's the foul? So very quickly, some examples then: neither culturally significant nor immediately recognizable. The woodblock prints, they were low culture when they were being borrowed by the early modern painters in Europe. No Japanese would have been offended by that because they were like manga today. They were like pop art. So this was not high culture. And nor would most Japanese have recognized that things like this on the right were inspired by woodblock prints. So neither culturally significant, the Japanese wouldn't have cared. And nor would they have immediately recognized it. Even if a Westerner had pointed it out, they probably would have said, really? Looks different to me, So absolutely not misappropriation in my view, right? Where's the harm? It was never, these forms were never culturally significant. The woodblock print form was not culturally significant, nor would it be instantly recognizable. The example I showed you of Wright using the Japanese house, likewise, this was any old house. It wasn't a particularly culturally significant house, nor was it instantly recognizable. I recognized it, but I've been studying this for a long time. But even most Japanese would look at the Lifehouse on the right and go, how is that Japanese? Even if it came from here, right? This traditional Japanese house was not unique, was not culturally special, or or significant, and would not have been recognized in its new context. Likewise, well, you could argue maybe that the Kongenzukuri plan was culturally significant, but it would not. So maybe I've miscategorized. Maybe this should be in the culturally significant but not instantly recognizable, because in Unity Temple, it's not clear that it's not obviously a Japanese building. Here's Alvaro Aalto borrowing the Stoa and the theater at Pergamon in one of his libraries. Again, it's questionable, and it's not for me to say whether this was culturally significant, but it's absolutely not instantly recognizable to most Greeks. And there certainly aren't any ancient Greeks around, right, who would sort of say, oh, that's a Greek building. So again, I would say not cultural misappropriation if it's not recognizable. What harm is it doing to Greek culture? And isn't this a positive way? Isn't this the way that culture feeds off other culture and civilizations advance? Right? So this is not a trivial discussion. That if we close down borrowing from other cultures, to a large extent, we want civilizations to sort of stay separate and not influence each other. Which I think is counter to all history and human nature. Second category would be culturally significant but not immediately recognizable. So the city of Nara in Japan, Heian-kyo, was based directly on the city of Chang, present-day Xi'an in China. But any Chinese walking through Nara, even in the 700s, would not have instantly recognized it, because it's an abstract plan, and the buildings would have been Japanese, not Chinese. So again, this is a culturally significant form, right? It has meaning in terms of Chinese culture, but it was not immediately recognizable in Nara. So I would argue no harm. Likewise, another criteria that I was going to talk about later is, what is the relationship between the cultures? And at this time, China was the dominant culture. China was not in danger of losing its identity, right? It actually would have appreciated and been flattered, I'm sure, that its neighboring civilizations were borrowing from it, because it was confident. Now, if you're the minority culture and a powerful culture is borrowing from you, that changes everything, right? And so power relation is another important criteria that I did not initially use, but I felt at the end that I probably should include that as a third category. Not only significance and recognizability, but the power relationship between the borrowed and the borrower. I mentioned the Japanese syllabary, and down the middle are Japanese Chinese kanji, but they're Chinese, and katakana on the right, katakana on the left, hiragana on the right. They both derive originally from Chinese characters, but they are made uniquely Japanese, to the point where most Chinese would say, how is that Chinese? It's not, Now these they would recognize, but these they would not. So again, these are examples of, well, surely, yes, the Chinese written character is enormously culturally significant, but not recognizable in its new context in the Japanese syllabary. So again, no harm, not recognizable, no harm, no foul, no misappropriation. Thirdly, not culturally significant, but immediately recognizable. So some of the copies that people like European artists like Van Gogh made directly of woodblock prints, it's kind of like naively kind of sweet, right? He even attempts to replicate some of the Japanese or Chinese script in his own kind of childlike characters, right? So he's making no secret. He's admiring and paying homage to Hiroshige. And these would not, as I said, you could argue that cherry blossom is culturally significant, but the woodblock print was not. It was like pop art. So instantly recognizable as Japanese, right? And making no secret of that, right? He's advertising it, but not culturally significant. So again, where is the harm to Japanese culture? No harm, no foul. Well, these are examples of rather ridiculous T-shirts, some of many, but this one in Japan and this one, I believe, in the States. And the one on the left, it may be hard for you to see at this level of magnification, but it means I'm reliably informed that it's fighting small elves. Okay, it comes from some obscure movie franchise, and the hero wears these T-shirts with really meaningless Chinese script, right? Likewise, the script on the right, it's the script is there because it's foreign script and it's supposed to be kind of interesting. So it's clearly on the left Chinese and on the right English, but it has no content. It's absolutely not culturally significant. It has no real meaning, right? No significant meaning. So it's instantly recognizable as foreign and chic, I suppose, but absolutely not culturally significant. So where is, again, if it's not culturally significant but recognizable, then there's no real tangible harm to that culture. Is Chinese any less because of that? Is English any less because of that ridiculous T-shirt? No, So where's no harm, no foul, right? Recognizable but not significant. And then lastly, the category that I think does reach the level of cultural misappropriation, where a form was significant in its original culture, and it's still instantly recognizable by most members of that culture in its new foreign context. So, for example, the famous Todaiji, the temple in Nara in Japan, was based on the palace, the imperial palace, not a temple, in Chiang. Now, I don't know how many contemporary Chinese would recognize it, but Chinese in the 700s who went to Japan, and there weren't many, a few Buddhist priests perhaps, but would have instantly recognized that, right? This was a very well-known building, right? It was one of the most important buildings in imperial China. So, the fact that Todaiji, a temple, was based on that would have been instantly recognizable. So you could argue that this is cultural misappropriation, except that China was the dominant culture. So where's the harm? This is, this tiny little culture next door that is basing its entire new civilization on borrowings from China. So I don't think many Chinese would have been too bent out of shape about that. But technically, it is culturally significant, a form, and would have been instantly recognizable by members of the original society. But because of the power relationship, I think no harm, effectively, because Chinese culture was perfectly confident that it was not going to be undermined or have its identity diluted because some small island culture next door had borrowed some built forms from it. Western painters also directly used Japanese objet d'art, right? The kimono, the woodblock prints, the screen. And I would argue, the kimono and the screen, particularly the kimono, at this time were symbols of Japan. Now, whether they were in Japan, but they certainly were in the West. So this, I would say, is instantly recognizable as Japanese. And the kimono, at least, I would argue, is culturally significant. So technically, well, more than technically, I'd say that this is a case of cultural misappropriation, where you're taking a form like a kimono and you're using it in a completely different context, and it's instantly recognizable, right? So, no, I don't know. I haven't checked with Japanese. Japanese at the time might well have felt flattered or offended. I don't know. But technically, according to the criteria I'm using, recognizability and cultural significance, the kimono looks like cultural misappropriation, particularly because the West was the dominant culture and Japan was the lesser culture at that time. At least the power, I would say lesser culture, but lesser power. Even more classic example of cultural misappropriation, right? The fans and the kimono and the fact that it's a Western model, right? For the same reasons, culturally significant and instantly recognizable by any Japanese. And this still goes on. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts, of all places, we're actually having people in 2015 dress up in kimonos in front of this same painting until somebody objected. This individual came in, with a poster and said, "Hey, this is, it's now the 21st century. Where's your cultural sensitivity?" They were actually encouraging visitors to dress up and have their photograph taken. And they were forced to issue a statement which basically said, well, we recognize that this is a subject of debate, but we're going to do it anyway, such as the Boston Museum of Art. But it's kind of shocking that in 2015, they were repeating the same cultural misappropriation that had happened a century earlier. And that was a top of the line museum of art. Things went the other way. Here is the Japanese Emperor Meiji on the right in traditional and Western military, in this case, military regalia, right? And on the left, the King of England and the Tsar of Russia. And you can see their military uniforms are almost identical with the Emperor Meiji's. So this is a Western symbol of military and imperial authority that the Japanese unashamedly imported in order to gain credentials as a member of the Western sort of big boys club. Now, this would be clearly cultural misappropriation according to the two original criteria of cultural significance, definitely, check that box. Recognizability, yes, any Westerner would have recognized this as military, Western military and imperial regalia. But because Japan was not the dominant culture, I wonder whether it really is. I think that changes everything. Borrowed scenery, you've all heard of this. It comes originally from China. It was borrowed from China and incorporated into Japanese gardens. And then certain Western artists, in this case, John Young, Northwest modernist from Portland, borrowed it again. And I would argue that this is culturally significant and probably would be recognized by somebody from Japan, possibly somebody from China. That may be a questionable example. More egregious examples, toiletries and beer based on Far Eastern religious symbols, which is, it's clearly culturally significant, these symbols, and clearly recognizable. And they did have complaints. Indian residents of England complained, and this beer was removed. It was taken off the market. I don't know that any Zen monks have ever complained. Maybe it's just a Zen thing that you don't complain about that. I think you just let it go. But the most egregious example that I know of is the usurping of the East Asian swastika, a symbol of light and good fortune, to commercial uses. Long before the middle of the 20th century, it was being used to sell products, including beer, right? And everybody thought it was fine. Even Western militaries before Germany, the British and Americans and Finnish air forces were commonly using the swastika on their vehicles, and it only is after it was taken over by the Nazi Party in the form of the Hakenkreuz that it gained this dreadful reputation, of course. But now it's effectively altered forever in the minds of many. Many Westerners still find it shocking to see swastikas on a map of Kyoto, not understanding that the swastika existed as a symbol for a temple long before it became a symbol of Aryan supremacy. So clearly, the most clear example of cultural misappropriation, cultural significance, instant recognizability, and deep offense for fairly clear reasons. To finish up with the most kind of silly version, but these Maori symbols were borrowed by the tattoo artist who made Mike Tyson's infamous face tattoo. That then got used in a pretty terrible film, The Hangover, and is now available online. But there was a lawsuit over this. And the irony is that the tattoo artist was able to claim money from the filmmakers for breaching his copyright on this tattoo. And yet he was able to borrow those forms from the Maori culture without any, the cultures have no copyright. An individual artist does, which seems insane to me. That the law has not caught up with this notion. So the tattoo artist made money out of Maori culture, and Maori culture, or the Maoris complained, but never got a cent or the removal of any of these uses of their culture. Thank you for your patience. I know I've gone over a little bit, but I think to sum up then, it's the ones at the bottom that tick all the boxes, and the power relationship between cultures at the time of the borrowing. Borrowing is the wrong word because people never give stuff back, but is a critical kind of that overrides the others in some cases. But anyway, I thought it was important to put in context what I've been talking about over the last couple of weeks to do with Wright and to do with Western perceptions of Japanese architecture. There's a much bigger question of the relationship of cultures and the movement of forms between cultures that this is a part of. Thank you again for your patience and
Yes, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I think thank you for your additional presentation. Yeah, I think it's interesting informations. And this is, I think there is another question from Mandarin Guntun about what happened with Japanese architecture now. Yeah, that's it's already moved to other ideas, and whether Japanese architectures today also take the idea rooted from the Japanese culture, yeah, compared to the metabolism, which is, I think, some of the modern architecture, Western modern architecture influence to Japanese architecture. And how about today? Is there what happened today?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't want to sort of give the impression that I absolutely know or have surveyed large numbers of Japanese architecture. This is my perception of the situation. So the honest answer is, well, I don't know for sure what the answer to that is, but I can give you a guess, I suppose, and it is a subjective opinion. As I said, architecture has become everywhere, and in particular in Japan, a branch of fashion. And I think that it reached that point in Japan very rapidly, where in order to get in the magazines, you have to get attention, just like you're selling a product. So anyone who's looked at any Japanese TV, and I'm sure it hasn't changed, I haven't watched it for years, but will know that Japanese advertising and Japanese TV in general is pretty extreme, compared to lots of other places. And that commercial competition to get attention, people, some of the advertisements, again, get famous press overseas because they're so outrageous compared and so unusual. And so I believe that the way Japanese architecture and Japanese architects operate, that they really understand. People like Kurokawa definitely understood, and Tange before him, I think, that he was in a commercial business, in a commercial culture, and in order to get a name, he needed to play that game and be a self-publicist and do things that would garner attention. So the Tokyo Bay project, I don't think that Kenzo Tange in his wildest dreams thought that was ever going to get built, but he got incredible free publicity and all sorts of presumably real clients by being on TV and being famous. So I think it's a phenomenon coming from this sort of commercialization of architecture, that architecture is a product, and in order to sell your product, you have to do something that is more attention grabbing than your competitors. So that's my guess. And to some degree, all, or most contemporary architecture are kind of in that, in this country and in others as well. but I think it's taken, and it's been that way for longer, and been taken to a greater extreme in Japan, where, you know, if you are going to get seen at all, you are going to have to do something extraordinary, and I think that's pushed Japanese architecture to do, well, quite frankly, you know, in some cases, you know, crazy stuff, you know, but it's often necessary. You know, some of the early work of some of the deeply respected architects today was not quiet and subtle. It was, you know, outrageous, and designed to get them attention. And once they got attention, then, you know, then they could settle into what they wanted to do. But there was this incredible pressure and competition. So that's my guess, that it's a move away. I don't want to completely generalize. I mean, there are contemporary Japanese architects who are actively trying to express their culture, but there's also this large strain of self-advertising and the need to do something different for the sake of doing something different, rather than because it's actually a major contribution. One of the characteristics, I suppose, is that metabolism was the last Japanese movement, right? And it's an exaggeration to even call that a movement, because it was like four guys who were brought together by another guy, you know, and they weren't working together other than on that manifesto. They didn't work on projects together, right? But even metabolism was the last thing that really had a major international effect on contemporary architecture worldwide, and that was the 60s, you know, like what is that, 50 years ago, right? Half a century ago was the last time that Japanese architecture really profoundly affected the direction. You know, there were all sorts of projects that arguably were affected by the Japanese metabolist ideas, you know, built projects in Western. But after that, although Japanese architecture has been constantly new, right? I can't put my finger on any single, you know, project or even architect who has had a massive influence abroad. You know, so that sort of innovation is sort of brief and limited, and then it goes on to the next innovation and the next innovation, but not the same kind of international effect that, for example, a Le Corbusier had, or Frank Lloyd Wright had, or metabolism had. You know, that people went off and actually imitated that. Now, there may be a few, you know, minimalists out there that are, you know, disciples of Sana, etc. But I think the newness of Japanese architecture it has to be constantly sustained, you know, and that seems to be the characteristic. Anyway, I don't know that I've answered your question, but that's my best guess at the phenomena that we see. This apparent enormous pressure to be different, always to be different, not only from others but from the last thing that you did. Ando would be one of the very few architects, stars in Japan, who has been completely consistent, pretty much, to the point of like, wow, it's another Ando building, you know. But a lot of the other well-known architects have, you know, are very proud of the fact that they alter their style according to their client. You know, there isn't the consistency that you would see in a Frank Lloyd Wright or a Le Corbusier. Now, that may be a characteristic of Japanese culture in general. It may be a characteristic of Japanese architectural practice that the client becomes, or it may be a product of this pressure that, no, I don't want to do the same thing I did last time because I want to get in the magazines. Frank Gehry has the opposite problem. Every client wants something that looks like the Bilbao Museum. He doesn't want to produce, you know, constantly be quoting himself. But in some cases, he has no choice. You know, the client came to him and says, I want one of those. And I think in Japan, it's the opposite, that there's this pressure. If you're going to get into magazines, you know, you don't want to be repeating what you've done or what somebody else has done. anyway, it's a really interesting, open-ended conversation that I would, I very much want to continue. I'm not thinking that I have, the answer at all, but a great question.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. And thank you to all the participants who raised the questions. Yeah. And I think we are now reach the time limits. Yeah. The lecture is already 2 hours now, and unfortunately that we have to end this lecture